Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Chairman Bernanke, in that stress test, you, I presume, assume that the Fed systems, including the credit default swaps that are backed nation to nation, would work. Is that correct? I mean, you weren't assuming a collapse of all of the, let's say, $1.4 trillion of exposure.
We didn't assume they would work. We checked to make sure we were comfortable with the counterparties.
So, but that means you graded yourself as that part working, correct?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. We looked at the CDS positions of the banks, and we verified first that they are largely hedged against sovereign default in Europe first, and then secondly, we looked at the counterparties of those credit default swaps and assured ourselves that they are widely dispersed and represent the strongest financial institutions in Europe.
Like AIG did a couple of years ago?
AIG is an example of what we don't see now. AIG was not appropriately regulated. It was not appropriately hedged. It didn't have sufficient capital behind those CDS. We know there's nothing like that kind of situation.
So you're comfortable today that there are no AIGs hiding in the woods, no FP sitting in some small company in London that essentially has bet the bank without us knowing it?
Well, our stress tests have covered all the largest bank holding companies in the U.S. We've looked also at other large banks with a somewhat less stressful and somewhat different approach. But within that whole range of U.S. financial institutions, we don't see any similar problem.
Thank you. That's one of the most important parts of today, is to ask the questions that weren't asked in earlier times before what couldn't happen occurred. Europe has the Eurozone has an economy we'll call nominally our size. It has a debt, if I'm roughly right, of Euro conversion of about $14 trillion of sovereign debt. Some countries actually have positives, but we'll just look at their sovereign debt across the board. So it's fair for the American people, not the talented economists, but for the American people to say, same size entity, similar debt to ours, not exact, but similar. If that's the case, why is it that they're not being treated, and this is a question for the American taxpayer, if you will, being treated much more like we treat our states? California doesn't look to Greece or Germany for a bailout. They look to the United States Federal Government. In other words, we're internal. What is the justification for the American people to understand of a zone similar size to ours, similar wealth to ours, similar debt to ours, looking around at the rest of the world and saying, what part will the United States put in to a European Union member such as Greece's problem?
Well, your question highlights the difference between Europe and the United States, which is we have a fiscal union as well as a monetary union. And as you point out correctly, the reason that we don't see the same kind of stresses at the state level is because implicitly there's support, from the Federal Government for the rest of the country.
Right. But for the taxpayer, and I want to get to Secretary Geithner too, for the taxpayer, heads they are very similar to us in the positive side. Human beings move freely within the Eurozone. Money moves freely. Most of the Eurozone is a single currency, and in fact, they basically act from a winning standpoint as a protective trade partners. They treat each other in a way they do not treat us, period. We simply do not enjoy the advantages of selling into the Eurozone that the Eurozone enjoys throughout the European Union. So the question is, for the American people, and by the way, this is not a question of why are we doing it in our own self-interest. I understand we're doing it in our own self-interest too. But the question is, why is it that the Eurozone isn't being asked by our government to step up much more and take more responsibility? Why is it comes to the American people at all? Not why is it in our best interest, but why does it come to the American people when, in fact, they have the same wherewithal, and when they're trading within each other, they trade like states, but when they have a problem with a rogue nation or two or three or four, they turn to the IMF and other external forces for which we participate?
Well, it's a good question. Our position, and perhaps the Secretary can speak to this from the Administration's point of view, the position of the United States has generally been that Europe needs to really step up and do a lot more. And we've been encouraging them to strengthen their firewalls, strengthen their fiscal compact, and essentially to move in the same direction as the United States is currently structured.
And, Mr. Secretary, as I go to you, I want to say this because, as you said in your statement, we have never lost a penny to the IMF. We have been fully repaid. Some might say that the interest has not always been what we would hope it to be, but in fact it has been a good bet overall for the world economy. But the American people are wondering what I asked, and I hope you can give it to us in a way. And the follow-up question I'll give you in advance, which is, doesn't it strengthen your hand when we make it clear that the American people are essentially saying no, and you're going to have to convince us, if you need large amounts of money, you're going to have to convince us to go against what is in fact the populist feeling within Mr. Cummings' communities and mine as well?
Well, we have a very similar view to the view you expressed. Europe has Europe's a very rich continent, absolutely has the means to solve this on their own. And you're right to point out that because they're a monetary union without a fiscal union, they don't have the mechanisms we have in the United States, not just to discipline the borrowing behavior of our states, which we have, but we have a set of fiscal transfers which are very powerful in the United States to soften the downturns that individual states might face. The IMF is an institution where members have a right to request assistance, and if they're prepared to meet the conditions the IMF establishes, then they have the right to request that assistance. And our judgment has been that it's been in the interest of the United States and fully consistent with its institution, and certainly better for us as a country, for the IMF to play a modest supplemental role alongside the much more dominant financial role of the European authorities going forward. And where they've asked us for the IMF to take more of the burden, we've said no, we don't think that's appropriate. So we're taking very much, I think, the approach you would take and most Americans would say, which is, they're a rich country. And in fact, nations around the world have taken a similar view, which is that let's make sure people understand for their strategy to work, the world needs to see Europe, that very rich nation, rich continent of Europe, demonstrate that they're prepared to do what it takes to make this work. And we can help with advice and some support on the margin. We're not going to do that in a way that puts the taxpayer, U.S. American taxpayer at risk, and we're not going to do it in a way that shifts the burden of solving their crisis to the American taxpayer.